For today's history video, I'd like to talk about the Bush-Kerry election of 2004. The election, of course, was conducted in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks at the very end of 2001, and it cast a long shadow over this election. We had been in Afghanistan, and then we had just invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein, and were mired in a seemingly endless guerrilla war in Iraq. So the foreign policy and defense dominated the election. But a funny thing emerged as the election unfolded. Every single issue there was favored Kerry, except for the war on terror, which favored Bush. So when you ask people in the polls who'll do the better job on the environment or education, or even things like taxes and the budget and fighting the deficit and stuff like that, Kerry would win. But then when you said who would do the better job of fighting the war on terror and maintaining strong defense, Bush would win by a huge margin, 67-24. And the Kerry campaign strategist fundamentally misunderstood the data. They thought that to win the election, they would have to try to move those numbers on terrorism and defense. The correct approach would have been to ignore it and try to focus the election on domestic concerns, which would obviously help Kerry. So in the first presidential debate, which was on foreign policy, Bush did a very effective job. He was very good because it was about the war on terror, and he did very well, and it added to his lead. Then in the second presidential debate, or I think actually the last presidential debate, I think there were three, the topics were dictated only on domestic policy. And Bush did well, but he basically got clobbered by Kerry because the issues are all so pro-Democrat. So he talked about Social Security and Medicare and the environment and a whole range of issues. And Bush was pretty flat-footed on most of them. So in the polling, immediately after that last debate, which was about 8 or 9 or 10 days before the election, Kerry had surged ahead of Bush and had taken a decisive lead for the first time in the presidential race. And it looked like Kerry might win. Then on the Monday, a week before the Tuesday election, 8 days out, the New York Times ran a front-page story that they had discovered a cache of weapons in Iraq that were abandoned and unguarded, and that the extremists, the militants who were fighting the American troops, had accessed that cache of weapons, and it was those weapons that were arming the insurgency that was killing American soldiers. A gigantic revelation of incompetence in the Bush administration. The Times ran it on the front page, and John Kerry immediately did the opposite of what he should have done. He pulled all his other ads off the air, stopped talking about Social Security or environment or education or the elderly or any of those issues, and instead put everything into that New York Times story about the weapons cache. All his ads were about that, and the whole campaign debate was about that. Well, Winston Churchill once said of a war in Asia, land war in Asia, don't go into the water to fight the shark. And that was a perfect case of what Kerry had done, because the Pentagon controlled this entire situation. And the Pentagon on Thursday released evidence that the weapons cache had in fact been captured, secured, and the weapons had been moved not by the rebels or by the insurgents, but by the U.S. Army to more secure locations, and that nothing had been stolen at all. The Times story was fundamentally flawed. And with that, Kerry's whole campaign just collapsed. It was like the air went out of it. You could hear the air rushing out of the balloon. With that, the only issue was the war on terror. And Bush had always had a lead on that, and he decisively defeated Kerry on that over the weapons cache issue in the last week. So on Election Day, Bush cruised to a fairly easy victory, but not before a very amusing thing. The exit polling, which had always been decisive in predicting the outcome, indicated that Kerry was going to win the election. And for the first hour or so of election night, everybody thought Kerry had defeated Bush. But the fact of the matter is that the exit polling was flawed. I realized that when the first state came in, Indiana, and I was able to compare their results that year with the previous year. And I put out a bulletin early in the evening that Bush had defeated Kerry, and then everybody else began to see that that was true. And it led to a real reform in the exit polling operation. There had been a deliberate effort by the Democrats to tilt the exit polling toward Kerry, and the goal was to get California and the western states to go more Democrat as the time zones kept those polls open later. Thanks for watching.